Hey guys, Slayerage here, and I'm going to talk in this video about why I decided to use a macro for the solo siege engine encounter on Heroic, and I would like to go ahead and start by saying what a macro is, because I know that a lot of people aren't aware of what a macro is and what it does, and so what a macro is it's a script that's run through an external piece of hardware that makes it where a single button press input turns into multiple button press outputs. So basically what that means is I have an adapter that I put into my console that I connect my controller to with a wire, and that adapter makes it where I can press one button on my controller and have it run through 3 or 5 different actions, So in the case of this ROM, what I had it do was where I would press down on my D-pad, it would then hold square on the controller and then double press the blink button. So what that turned into was the down button on my D-pad turned into the pick up the part and blink button. That's what the idea of a macro is. It's good for getting things that require frame perfect timing or really, really high speed, which in this case I use the frame perfect timing aspect of it, but generally speaking, a macro is not something that I would recommend for really anything at all, so don't get your hopes up too high here, because first of all, the adapter itself costs $50, which is not really not cheap, and it's not really useful, because if you were to try and take it into something like PvP on really any class other than the Titan, you're going to struggle to find anything that you can do with it that's useful whatsoever. And even on a Titan, it's really not going to be that useful, and if you used it on a Titan, you'd probably just get banned. And that's just without going into specifics of what you could do with it, but the point is, people are not going to embrace cheating in a competitive activity in the game, and they will look to ban you as pretty much as quick as they can. So you're then thinking like, well, you used it in PvE, so maybe I'll get one for PvE, right? But the thing is, it's not really useful for PvE either. I thought about all the different low man challenges in Destiny, and the only times I can think that you might be able to get anything out of this at all are trying to optimize your damage a little bit better at Axis by getting perfect timing on your cannon shots, and trying to get Oryx to be weak in a solo with Titan challenge prior to the light level update most recently. And I don't actually know anything about the second challenge, so I'm kind of on the edge about that one to bring it up as an example, but I've been told that there's a relatively small window that a macro would help you hit more consistently. But at any rate, that point aside, that means there's a ton of challenges where this is useless and a ton of different contexts where it's useless because it's just really not that helpful. It doesn't make much of a difference for just about anything. So my point is, it's a pain in the butt, good chance that it would consider getting you banned in a lot of cases, and if you want to buy it for something like what I'm doing here, where you're just, doing a solo challenge that's not really competitive at all, then I mean, yeah, you could buy one, but I would go ahead and say that generally speaking, it is not worth the money, the time, or the risk of being banned for the vast majority of people. So that said, you're probably wondering, well, why would you use a macro? Because you pretty much made it sound like it's cheating, right? And just to be perfectly clear, yes, it is cheating. It is cheating to use a macro, but I don't think this run is possible without cheating, and for that reason, I think that I was the first to decide that this category of tool-assisted run was necessary for the solo siege engine, and I will get to that point a little bit later, but for right now, let's get to why I think a macro was necessary. So, I did not start by using a macro. That was not my first thought. My first thought was not, well, let's just do this the easy way because I can't think of any hard way. It was, let's see if there's any hard way for hours and test every different option as much as I can, and then at some point when my creative limits were met, at that point I gave in. So let's talk about the different things that I tried before I gave in and started using a macro. So the first thing that I decided to try and use was different agility buffs. We're talking things like Pulse Wave or Fleet Fire, those kinds of agility buffs, things that would give you really short, high bursts of speed. And what I found doing that was that Fever and Remedy, the raid hand cannon, has a perk on it called Quick Reaction that you could proc pretty reliably before picking up a part every time and use that to go really, really fast with just one part. But the problem with it was it lasted such a short time that it couldn't be used to gain any significant advantage in terms of speed. So, given that these were hard to use and the lack of ease of use essentially made it a time waste, because think about this, if you've got the raid hand cannon and you're killing an ad before actually picking up the part, then you're probably going to be standing on top of the part before you pick it up a couple times, and every moment that you're like on top of a part but not picking it up when you're able to is wasted time. So based on the fact that it was kind of wasted time, it didn't really make you go fast enough, and I couldn't seem to combine the buffs in a meaningful enough way that it would actually work. I kind of moved away from the idea of agility buffs on their own. So even though they are useful, they are not good enough. I also tried all the different subclasses and the various abilities they have. That means, like on Titans, I was trying to use the Twilight Garrison while picking up a part, which you can do, but it doesn't help. you can use the catapult jump when picking up a part, which can give you some vertical lift and some, momentum going forwards, but it's just not enough to make the difference. I tried using the focus burst on a warlock. I tried using the Bones of EO double control jump with a hunter and double higher jump, and without Bones of EO, the control jump and the higher jump. And I tried Shadestep. And the amount of movement abilities in the game is not really all that high. There are things like Titan skating, there is Warlock skating with the sword, which I didn't try that for testing, but I have to imagine it would be pretty dang hard and not really any better than what I wound up doing. And I've actually been told since that it is not good enough to work because the timing needs to be really, really good. But at any rate, moving on from that particular point, there's basically Shadestep and Twilight Garrison as actual movement options that will allow you to pick up the part. So the reason that those two options stand out more so than other options is because they don't immediately pick up the part. When you use Shadestep to pick up a part, your character is rolling forward after picking up the part without picking it up. So what you're doing is you're doing the 1 second to pick up the part, you're Shadestepping forward, and then after you finish your Shadestep, that's when the encumbered debuff starts, and you get 10 seconds from that point. So you basically get all the distance of Shadestep for free. That's what makes Twilight Garrison and Shadestep such desirable movement abilities as compared with something like Catapult Jump on a Titan, where even though it does boost you forward a little bit, it still starts the encumbered debuff immediately, which means that overall you're not going to be able to get as much distance out of it. So between all the different abilities that I tested, which I know I haven't gone into too much depth on that, but believe me, I spent a couple hours doing this. I was trying everything that I could think to try as far as movement abilities, as well as different abilities that could be used to maybe push the parts, which I just came to the conclusion it's not consistent enough to do. And after all of that testing, I came to the conclusion that Shadestep was the best option outside of Blink. So that brings us to the strengths and weaknesses of Shadestep. So the very first thing, like I said, a huge strength of Shadestep is that it gives you free distance moving the part without it taking any of your encumbered debuff. So that's just straight up free movement that you get to do. The second thing that's really good about it is it's practical. You can get it every time if you actually have good timing, and it is possible to mess it up, but it's possible for a human to do. It's reasonable to expect a human to get Shadestep right every single time in an actual run. So that's another big advantage of it. It also gives you access to camo, which Night Stalkers have. You can combine it with the use of Keen Scout if you wear the Graviton Forfeit exotic, and you have double jump available at all times, which means that you still haven't given up all of your vertical mobility in the event that it was actually useful. So that's kind of an advantage. And between those factors, it seems like, for all intents and purposes, Night Stalker is the only real option as far as non-blink movements to get the pieces into the ship. So I don't think Shadestep is good enough. So what you're going to see in the clip that's playing right now is that even with really good movements on all three of my Shadesteps, and these are purely theoretical movements, by the way, I can't actually take this route in the middle of a run without being basically suicidal. So I'm going for, as far as I can tell, the fastest route that uses Shadestep and Keen Scout to the best of their ability, and I still don't go far enough to actually get the warhead in or the engine block in within 3 movements. So if I can't get the warhead and the engine block in within 3 movements, that means this is impossible. So you're probably thinking like, well, if you got it in really quickly on the 4th movement, maybe it would be possible. But the thing is, that's just not true. I've done the math and I've done the testing, and it does not actually work to try and get the pieces in. So my idea here, testing-wise, was that I would do a purely theoretical route to prove that even in the event that you somehow managed to get the best luck possible so that you could take the best route possible, you still wouldn't go fast enough. And I say, again, not fast enough because it doesn't get 2 pieces in within 3 movements. The reason that this is a big deal, the reason that you can't afford to not get a piece in within 3 movements is because every time you take an extra movement to bring a piece in, you're getting an extra exhausted debuff. So mechanically, the reason this is important is if I take 3 movements to get a part in, that means I move it forward, I get exhausted, I move it forward, I get exhausted, I move it forward, and I put it in without getting the exhaustion debuff. So that saves me some time every time I manage to do that. In the case of my run on the video, I was able to do it with Blink using a macro, and I had to go about 7 seconds back to each part. So that means there's a 3-second time save, because if I'd been exhausted for 10 seconds, I wouldn't be able to pick it up until 10 seconds had passed, instead of only 7 returning back to the pieces. And I could be wrong about that exact number, but the point is, every time you actually have to wait out a piece, you then put in extra time for picking it up, extra time for shade stepping, extra time for exhaustion, and you're not really getting anything out of it. You lose about 12 to 13 seconds every time you take an extra movement on top of whatever you've already got. So my numbers looking at this are debatable. I'm not going to say that they're perfect, but what I could tell as far as a piece movement goes is that a shade step takes about 12 seconds. That's what you get when every time you move a part for 10 seconds using shade step. Because you pick up the part for about a second, you shade step forward for about a second without getting encumbered, and then you're encumbered for about 10 seconds, right? So that's 12 seconds, and then you have the exhaustion debuff for another 10 seconds on top of that. So each movement with shade step leading up to the final resting place of the pieces is going to take you in total 22 seconds. So because nobody's arguing that you can get a piece in 2 movements, that means that it's going to take you 22 seconds times 3 movements times 2 pieces, which is 132 seconds, to get the pieces into the place right before where you're actually able to put them in. Like, for 2 movements for each piece takes 132 seconds. And I would also say that it takes, as I said before, about 5 seconds to kill the captain so that the parts drop in the first place anyway. So you're looking at 195 seconds minus 132 seconds, which means about 63 seconds are remaining on your clock after the first 6 movements. And if you can't get it in 3 movements, those 63 seconds are not going to be enough. So what I would assume is a pretty reasonable number for picking up the drive shaft and actually getting it in, which in itself is kind of a feat, is you would take another second to pick it up, another second to shade step with it, another about 9 seconds to pull it forwards, that's 11, and then you don't get the exhaustion debuff, and you run back to the other pieces for about 7 seconds. It takes about 18 seconds, give or take, off of the remaining 63 that you have, which brings you down to 45, right? And then when you're down at 45 seconds, you pick up the engine block and the warhead once each and try to bring them into the ship. And because you can't get them in this movement, what you're going to wind up doing is running your clock down to 1 second remaining, where you could then be in the middle of picking up the engine block or the warhead before the screen turns white and you lose. So I don't think that that's necessarily completely inarguable. And if you were able to get the warhead in, that would be something of a game changer, because let's say that instead of, failing with the remaining time after getting the drive shaft in, you would then go back to the warhead, pick it up, move it forward, or pick it up for a second, shade step for a second, and then, so going back to your 45 seconds remaining with the warhead, you would then pick it up for a second, shade step for a second, bring it forward for 10 seconds to put it in, and then not have the exhausted debuff. So that would in total take you 12 seconds, and then you would have to run back to the engine block, which is going to take probably about another 8 seconds. So you're looking at 20 seconds off of the remaining time, right? And that brings you down to 25 seconds. And 25 seconds isn't like completely unthinkably impossible, I suppose, to get the engine block in, because you could then pick it up, shade step, crouch forward the whole way for the entire 10 seconds, and then you'd have it on the stairwell on the left side, potentially. That may be the quickest route to it. And you would have, at that point, 3 seconds remaining. And the thing is, 3 seconds still really isn't enough, because you would pick it up in shade step and you'd be kind of right in front of where the engine block needs to be deposited, and you'd be a second or 2 off. But here's the thing that really is the kicker about why this is impossible, is you're probably thinking like, well, what if I somehow manage to shave off that second? Like, you made it sound like it's just the teeniest, tiniest bit too slow. All it's going to take is a little bit of optimization to make that work. And SC Slayerage, I saw you throw that piece, the engine block, in your run. If you can throw the engine block with the sword, think of the time saved there. And what you've got to realize is that, I feel like I'm being pretty thorough here. I accounted for the ability to throw pieces. And the thing is, they don't throw consistently. The engine block, conveniently enough, since it is the farthest piece, can be thrown relatively consistently compared to the others. It can be pushed relatively consistently compared to the others, but it's just not enough movement to make it possible to get it in 3 movements. The throw that I got in that clip that played a moment ago was really that's a really good example of how far you can throw it. It's not going to go that far the vast majority of the time, and again, even if it does, I still wasn't able to get the piece in only 3 movements, and you can't control it. It would just be relying on way too much inconsistency to actually be practical for any strategic purpose. So my point there is I really don't think that you're going to be able to get the engine block in 3 movements, kind of no matter what, using Shadestep. And then in the event that you are still absolutely dedicated to try that, because I said it was only a 1 second difference off, you have to consider that I'm making the very generous assumption that you miraculously managed to get the warhead in, which you can't really throw the warhead because the fact that it's cone-shaped means every time it hits the floor it's just more inclined to spin in place than it is to actually roll forwards. And on top of that, it's not just as far as the engine block, but it's far enough that you can't get it in 3 movements. So I mean that's a generous assumption. Getting the warhead in only 3 movements would be a real feat. That would be something that would be very difficult to do using this strategy. So between those 2 things, it's basically impossible from even a theoretical standpoint. But then on top of that, you have to, layer in practicality. You have to say, like, okay, well, realistically, I'm probably not going to always be standing directly on top of the piece after my exhaustion buff ends and holding the square button. Like, you literally, in order to not lose time here, you have to be prepared to pick up the piece the exact instant that your exhaustion debuff ends, which, considering you're going to have to go out of your way to kill Mexus in this strategy, that's not realistic. Considering you're going to have to tether the ads and kill them all to get through this without dying consistently, that's going to be a time loss. Like, there's pretty much no way to do both of those things without actually wasting a second or 2 of non-encumbered, non-exhausted time. So I don't know if I've really proved conclusively that this is impossible, but in my mind, I do not see any other option past this point, because the thing is, there's a lot of strategic work to get even this far. It wasn't like I was just giving it, this was the first thing I came up with and the first thing that other people came up with in terms of what is the best strategy without blink. This was the ultimate non-blink strategy. Like, if you try to use a Titan, for instance, you don't have any movement ability aside from Twilight Garrison that doesn't delay picking up the piece. And you don't really have many agility buffs that you can actually keep reasonably stacked. Fleet Fire lasts about 15 seconds, I believe, and that's significant, but keeping it ×3 requires you to kill 3 enemies with solar abilities, and realistically, with only 1 grenade and 1 melee, you're not going to be able to kill that many Vandals with Stoke the Forge. You're not going to be able to use your super to get the Fleet Fire up that many times. Like, you can get a little bit of extra speed out of it, but it's just not enough to be a game changer. And ultimately, a Titan is going to have to walk the same path. So that's really the caveat to this whole problem of can it be done without blink, is that without blink, you really cannot jump the piece into the ship consistently. And if you can't jump the piece into the ship consistently, you have to kill Mexus. And if you have to kill Mexus, you have to waste time. And most importantly of all, coming in from the right side is that is the entire reason that you cannot get the engine block in within 3 movements. If the engine block was on the other side of the ship, there might actually be some kind of long shot hopeful chance that this could be done with Shadestep. Like, if you took the ship and then just mirrored it so that everything that was on the left was on the right, then you would be able to walk up the ramp behind the siege engine and take a left to put the drive shaft in and just go to the back to put the engine block in, and you'd still go to the middle to put in the warhead, this is basically what you're doing using the blink strategy. And that's more reasonable because you have like a relatively smaller disparity between where the parts go in. When you enter from the ramp, normally the drive shaft is really close, the warhead is pretty far, and the engine block is really far. But if you enter on the opposite side using blink, the drive shaft is a little far, the warhead is a little farther, and the engine block is about as far as that is. And none of those is anywhere near as far as the engine block is in the non-blink scheme. So what I'm getting at here is that for the main reason that you can't do this without blink is that you have to enter the siege engine from a very, very impractical location that forces you to do extra piece movements that then make the amount of movement that you need to do in time impossible, even from a purely theoretical standpoint. And a purely theoretical standpoint, again, is still not good enough in practice to make it realistic on any level. So I don't know that that really definitively proves that Shadestep is not an option, but it definitely should at least let you think that hopefully you believe me when I say that Twilight Garrison is not an option, the Hunter jumps are not an option, the Warlock jumps outside of Blink are not an option, and the main reason that Hunter is such a viable option, by the way, part of the reason that it's so good outside of Shadestep being a good option is Keen Scout, because you get a higher amount of agility than you would with any other movement in the game. So there's some food for thought for why Titan and Warlock and any other Hunter subclass aren't really that desirable by comparison. So you're really looking at, as far as I can tell, the ultimate non-blink strategy, but it's not good enough. So I think that that's probably been discussed and demonstrated to hopefully a sufficient point that you're willing to at least, like, reason with me that, hey, what if you used control jump? You could then go fast. Oh, right, that's right. You're picking up the part immediately. If you do that, you're not getting your free distance out of it. Never mind, maybe that wouldn't work because you can't get the pieces far. Hopefully that at this point you can't think of anything that hasn't been already thought of in terms of what is a different option here. So part of the reason that people think that it is possible to do without Shadestep, in my view, and call me arrogant if you want, is that they were not thorough with their calculations in terms of what time is remaining. I've seen a lot of people saying that, every time you're exhausted, you have 10 seconds to kill ads. Every time you pick up the part, it takes 20 seconds to move it forwards. And those just aren't the right numbers, because encumbered and exhausted does not cover the entire time that you move the part. You have to have the time for picking up the part, which cannot happen while you're exhausted, and you have to have the time for using your movement ability with the part, if you are, which takes another second on top of that, but is, necessary to get the maximum amount of distance in. So you got 2 seconds right there. Really, in all of reality, it's probably closer to 3 in a lot of cases. And then when it comes to the exhausted debuff, you have 10 seconds of exhaustion, but whenever you drop a part off, you have to go from that part to the next part and be on top of it for efficiency purposes to immediately pick it up as soon as your exhaustion runs out, which means that if you're going from point A to point B as fast as you can using Shadestep and Keen Scout with a part, you're probably going to have to go about 6 seconds in the opposite direction to get back to where the parts were, right? Because, I'm picking up the part and Shadestepping and then using the next 10 seconds of my time to get as far away from the other parts as I can. So that total movement distance needs to be covered again in the opposite direction to prepare me for picking up the next part, which, because this is an 11 seconds of movement in one direction, which is 1 second of the Shadestepping and 10 seconds of the Keen Scout crouching, I then have to go back in the opposite direction for about 6 seconds to get back to where the parts are. So that leaves 4 seconds of exhaustion that I can use, right? But the thing is that 4 seconds is then further broken down, because if I try to go all 4 seconds out of my way on a detour to kill some ads, then I have to go 4 seconds back, and suddenly I've used 14 seconds instead of the actual 10 exhaustion seconds. So the point is, you have to spend about 6 seconds going back to where you were, and then of the remaining time, you can only use half of it to actually detour yourself, because you still need the other half of the remaining time to get back off the detour. So realistically, every time you get exhausted, you're looking at about 2 seconds of time that you can just actually truly waste in terms of movement without having too much time committed to doing things that aren't actually moving the pieces. Now, that's a big advantage of using Gallahorn, because if you have a sword on, you're not going to be able to, you're going to have to use those 2 seconds to detour like I did in my Blink video. But if you had Gallahorn on, you could, to some extent, not actually have this issue, and you would still just need to be moving back towards the parts without necessarily giving up extra time because of a detour. However, the problem with Gallahorn is that it doesn't have infinite ammo, and it is pretty crappy for damage in terms of the ammo that it does have. So I guess the point that I'm getting at here in terms of thoroughness is people arguing that it's possible to do this they're overestimating the amount of time they have to kill ads. They're thinking, I have 10 seconds, you really don't. They're also not thinking about the fact that you have to move the parts, and that even though the movement ability doesn't. It's purely helpful when you're using something like Shadestep or Twilight Garrison. It's still counting against your time for a meaningful purpose, because you pick up the part, then there's the delay for the movement ability, which costs time, and then there's the 10 seconds of encumberment, and then there's also just the picking up the part itself. So between all of those factors, I mean, again, overestimating time to kill adds, and then the amount of time that it takes to move goes from being, instead of 120 seconds for the first two movements for each piece, to 132 seconds for the first two movements for each piece. And then if you didn't use a movement ability, it would go down to somewhere closer to 126 seconds, but then you're losing all of that free movement that you can get, which is really valuable free movement, because the whole way that this works with the parts is every time you pick one up, you're committed to at least 10 seconds of exhaustion and at least 1 second of picking it up. So you got at least 11 seconds of burned time every time you pick up a piece without putting it in. And you want to make the most use of the encumbered time or the movement ability as you can, since you're already committed to an 11-second time loss. So that is why I think that it is impossible to do with Shadestep or Twilight Garrison or Warlock Jump or any other ability, is that without being able to blink your way into the ship, you are just not going to be able to cover the ground in time. So at this point, hopefully, I mean, it's been 26 minutes. Hopefully you can see why I don't think that it is possible to do this without blink. And at this time, it's probably good to go ahead and start discussing why I don't think blink is humanly possible. Because the thing about blink is a lot of people are saying, oh, it's a frame-perfect movement. Those are used in all kinds of other games, so therefore they should be used in Destiny too. And that is a very non-critical argument. They're not again, this is not being thorough. They're not thinking through what they're actually demanding of the PvE challenge players. Because when you talk about games that have frame-perfect movements, you're looking at things like Street Fighter, combat techniques. You're looking at Super Mario challenge levels. You're looking at like Ocarina of Time speedruns. Like, those are the different types of places that you're going to see frame-perfect movements. And you know what a consistent theme between those three things is? Is that they are games with simpler mechanics and physics. And when I say simpler, I don't mean easy, because the movement mechanics and the fighting mechanics, I'm sure, in Street Fighter are very complex at a high level. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of the actual physics of the game, it is a side-scroller. It is 2D. There is not anywhere near as much movement to account for at one time. And because the games have been out and they have like a legacy and people have been playing them for a very long time and competing in them for a very long time, there is a scene for the game dedicated to mastering the skills required to beat other players, and there's a competitive advantage in learning how to do frame-perfect movements in a game like that. In Ocarina of Time speedruns, there is a competitive advantage to learning to do frame-perfect movements. In Super Mario Maker, there's a competitive advantage to learning that. So the point is, there's incentive in those games. They're simpler, and because they are simpler, it is much more reasonable to expect someone to be able to figure out a frame-perfect movement. And then on top of that, you can practice those movements. In Street Fighter, you can fight against an AI. In Mario Maker, you can do the challenge level over and over and over again. And if you're struggling with a part, then you could even just remake that part if you needed to get the movement down. And then the other thing is that in those games, timing is the only concern. It's the only thing that's actually hard when you're doing those movements. Right? Like when you're playing Mario and you need to jump through a hoop or whatever, and it's like a really ridiculously narrow window and you need to get it frame perfect, you actually can do that because you're not doing anything else that's that complex mechanically. You're probably like moving left or right or pressing a couple other buttons. Whereas in Destiny, you're not just getting the frame perfect timing on the movement right itself. You have to be able to move in a reasonable path with the blink. You have to account for the fact that you can't make your camera angle take the part out of view, and you can't bump into the part because for some reason that seems to mess up the timing too. And between those three things, it just gets a lot harder to do a frame-perfect movement because you're juggling a frame-perfect movement on top of a bunch of other things, which is not as true in other games. And I'm not saying it's not entirely true in other games, because obviously there's a huge amount of technical skill demand in other games that require frame-perfect movements. But in Destiny, doing something like this is a huger technical skill demand, and it has absolutely no, learning curve. With Street Fighter, you start on a basic combat level, and then you get better, and you get better, and you get better until the point that you're doing like 5-frame window movements, and 3-frame window movements, and 1-frame window movements are the culminating point of all that practice. But in Destiny, there is not that buildup of skill. You don't get to experience any success in this challenge unless you are already a robot, because the amount of precision required is absurdly high right out the gate. There's no training wheels. You don't get better as you go, and then eventually it puts the really hard burden on you. You just start at the absolute hardest part, and that's where you're expected to be able to perform, apparently, by some of the Destiny community, which is unrealistic. So I don't claim to understand the other games to a perfect extent, but I do think that when you see games with frame-perfect movements, they are, generally speaking, not games as complex as Destiny is on a mechanics and physics level. And if someone wants to prove me wrong and show that that's something that other games are doing, that's fine, but it doesn't completely detract from my point, because we've still got a way to go on why it's not possible for a person to do blink. So on top of the fact that it is more complicated in Destiny than other games, which if someone wants to argue that, again, feel free to argue that. You might have a point. I'm not going to say that it's impossible you do. But what Destiny does have is inconsistency, right? When I had a macro, I still picked up the part at the wrong point, often. Like, there were a lot of times where I would pick up the part and not blink, despite the fact that I was using a macro, which made my timing perfectly consistent. And even if the timing itself isn't perfect, you would think that a perfectly consistent input via the macro would then result in a perfectly consistent output via blinking with the piece. But it didn't. And because it didn't give me a perfectly consistent output, it's not reasonable to expect a person to learn, because if the person did the perfectly consistent inputs and they got perfect at actually pressing the buttons in time, they would only be able to learn if they actually saw that every time they got the timing right, they got the blink right, so that they could connect, this is the timing I need, 950 milliseconds is the timing I need to get this blink right. But because it doesn't work consistently, you're never going to be able to draw that pattern reasonably, because there's an inconsistency due to maybe camera rotation, maybe like character movement, and maybe even just frame rate fluctuation that you couldn't even account for. But whatever the reason is, first of all, it's unclear, and secondly, there is inconsistency. But if you're playing a game like Street Fighter and you do a frame-perfect movement perfectly, it's going to work every time. If you do play Super Mario Maker and you get a frame-perfect movement, it's going to work every time. And the fact that those things work every time makes it rewarding to actually try and learn them from a technical standpoint, because one, again, you can prove your skill by doing that, and then two, you actually get a payoff for doing it every time. So to reiterate the first 2 points about this whole thing, you actually have a simpler game where it's easier by comparison to do a frame-perfect movement, and you have a game where it is consistent, and so it is reasonable to expect someone to learn the frame-perfect movement. And then on top of both of those considerations, Destiny is not a game that's designed to be practiced like that. It really isn't. When you play Street Fighter, again, you can fight an AI. You can go into a practice mode and practice your button combinations until you get them perfect. In Mario Maker, you can start at level 1 until you get to level 999,000. Like, you can build up skills as you go, and you can practice the exact frame-perfect movement that you want to practice while you are getting there. But in Destiny, you don't have that opportunity. When you're trying to get into the Siege encounter, where you actually move the parts, you spend, like, I don't know, 20 seconds loading in, you spend about a minute killing the left turret, the right turret, the core, and then hopping on top of the Siege engine, and then you spend about 20 seconds running to where the captain drops the parts and killing him. So all of that time added together is about a minute and 40 seconds. From when the captain spawns, you have 3 minutes and 20 seconds to actually practice moving the pieces. 3 minutes and 20 seconds is exactly double a minute and 40 seconds, which means that in total, a third of the time that you spend practicing, quote-unquote, to get these piece movements down is just burned by doing stuff that's not practicing. So that's a huge time sink that's just not really realistic to expect anyone to do. And there's not any other area that works similarly in the game. Like, you can pick up other relics in the King's Fall area or in the Echo Chamber strike, but the Echo Chamber one allows you to use movements, and the one in the King's Fall the one in the King's Fall raid has a different timing. You pick it up faster, and because of that, there's nowhere to practice this in any meaningful way outside of the Wrath of the Machine raid. And because this is the only place to practice it, but you have to burn a third of the time doing it, you're talking about a tremendous time waste if you're asking someone to try and learn this. And in addition to that time waste, whenever you do actually spend the 3 minutes and 20 seconds practicing, every time you pick up a part, Even if you're successful, you get a 10-second exhaustion. That 10-second exhaustion is 10 seconds that you're not allowed to practice. If you don't pick up the part and you blink, you, first of all, obviously haven't learned anything, because you need to get it right to actually really learn, even though I guess you could argue getting it wrong is necessary to learn too. But anyway, the point is every time you blink, there's a 3-second cooldown on that. So you get to try to blink, and then you get to try to blink, and then you have to wait 3 seconds, and you have to wait 3 seconds, and you have to wait 3 seconds. And then if you pick the part up, you have to wait 10 seconds. And realistically, you only get to practice the frame-perfect movement at the end of this about 4 or 5 times per minute, which is absolutely pitiful. And I mean, the whole of this story combines together here is that it is unrealistic to expect someone to get a movement down consistently that a computer cannot get down consistently. It is unrealistic to expect someone in a game as complex as Destiny to get a frame-perfect movement right consistently, given the conditions in terms of camera movement and frame rate fluctuation that are possible in terms of messing you up and creating confounds. And then it is unrealistic to expect someone to make the time investment when such a gigantic amount of the time would be wasted, and you would still only be practicing something that is inconsistent. So on top of all of this, you're probably thinking, well, you know, someone could still do it. There's probably a guy in the audience that's like, well, harumph. Destiny is a game where I want people to spend thousands of hours of their lives mastering something that's only going to get used in one YouTube video that's going to be forgotten next week. And because that nerd is in the audience, I'm going to go ahead and tell you exactly what the window is for success with the macro, which it turns out 940 milliseconds was really, really inconsistent. You'd pick up the part sometimes, but most often you wouldn't. 950 milliseconds was really consistent. You would pick up the part almost every time, but not every time. And then 960, you pick it up, you know, a good 70% of the time or so. So basically, you've got this window where there's different outputs that are going to be more or less likely. And so with 950 milliseconds being the best option, but 960 not working that well, and 940 not working that well, 960 and 950 are the only real options, and 70% of the time wouldn't really be good enough for a human to want to attempt this, I guarantee you. And, you know, 90% of the time is the only time that's actually really reasonably good enough to where it makes sense for a human to want to do something at that level. And I might be underestimating the success at 960. You know what? Let's just say that I am for the sake of argument. That would mean that your realistic window for not screwing up a blink most of the time would be 950 to 960 milliseconds, also known as a, you know, 0.01, second window. But let's just double it for the sake of argument. You have, you know, a 50th of a second to get this right, give or take. So it's not even really truly an entire frame that you have to do this. It's not even a frame perfect movement. For some reason it seems to be harder than that according to the results the macro were giving us. And given that it's a 50th of a second, that's not something that we've ever really seen people do in video games. A lot of games where they do frame perfect movements have frame rates like 20, or at the very worst 30, and they are frame perfect movements as opposed to, you know, 1/50th of a second movements. So the fact that it takes a 50th of the window is a 50th of a second is a completely unreasonable number to expect anyone in the world to get consistently. And then even if you did get it consistently, again, it still wouldn't work consistently. I mean, the amount of confounds here is just absurd. Anyway, so someone might think, you know, enough practice would be enough to get you to do this. And if someone thinks that, then they probably don't have much experience with the idea of timing something that precisely. And I would encourage them to pull out like a stopwatch from, I don't know, somewhere online would probably be the best way to do this. Just like Google a stopwatch and then try and get something down to where you're pressing a button to stop it between 1 second and between 1.02 seconds. So you need to get it in that window every single time. So 1.0000000 to 1.01999999 or 1.02 or whatever. Try and get that window 9 times in a row and see if you can. And then realize that even if you could do that, it's still not anywhere near as difficult as it would be in practice, because first of all, you have to press a button twice to blink, and you have to press a button combination by holding square to do it, and you have to fight with all the other different situational variables in terms of ads shooting you and making sure that your movement direction is right and making sure that your camera angle is not going to move the part out of view. Like there's a lot to fight there. So I don't know if I have really convincingly proved my point here that blink is a completely unreasonable expectation to expect any person to learn, but in my view, blink is a completely unreasonable expectation for any person to learn. The other thing about blink is that it is just you can't reduce the amount of uses. Like, I could probably get blink about a third of the time, and if I could get it a third of the time, maybe I'd be willing to say, like, okay, well, 1 in 27 odds isn't that bad. If I can get an actual attempt 1 in 27 times, maybe I just practice this a lot more and get to where I could, do it if only 3 blinks were necessary. But the thing is, to get the piece in position to blink it onto the siege engine, you need to use blink to get there. So you're not really able to use fewer than 9 blinks because you need 9 blinks to actually get to the blur. You need 6 blinks to get to the final blink position, as far as I can tell. And that's because the sword movement with blink on top of blink makes it possible to get a lot of distance pretty reasonably. You can see that I use that a lot in the actual solo video. So if you don't get blink every time, or almost every time at the very least, the first 3 movements aren't as important, but I got lucky in the actual run that I completed because when I threw the warhead, it went about as far as the warhead ever does. If it hadn't gone very far, I probably would have been totally screwed. You really need to get 9 blinks, and getting 9 blinks is not realistic for a human to do. So now there's probably someone saying, and I have seen this argument, that, well, if you can get blink once, then you can get it every time, right? But that's not a good point either, because the fact that you got it once doesn't mean that it's reasonably repeatable. I mean, I know it's not a pure luck situation, but just because you win the lottery doesn't mean you can win the lottery 9 times in a row. Like, the odds of something like that happening just get astronomically unlikely in even 2 occurrences, really. I mean, if you're talking about, I spent like 7 hours practicing blink before I decided that it wasn't going to happen without a macro, and after 7 hours-ish, I only got to where I could blink with the part about a third of the time, and even that might be an overestimate, but let's just say a third for the sake of being generous to make the point. And if I can blink about a third of the time with the part, there are going to be people who can argue, well, that says that it's possible, so you shouldn't just give up. But the thing is, a third of the time getting the part right means that every single time I'm doing that challenge, every single time I pick up one of the parts, there's a better chance that I'll fail than that I'll succeed. So the actual math that you would do to determine what the likelihood of a successful run on the blink portion of it is, if you got it a third of the time, is 1/3 to the 9th, because you have to do it 9 times. That winds up being about 0.005% chance of actually getting the blinks right, which means that you'll get it about 1 in every 20,000 tries, on average. Getting it once in every 20,000 tries means that I would have spent about 640,000 hours because I had the timing perfect every time. But if I only get the timing perfect 1 in every 20,000 runs, because I can only actually reasonably get it about a third of the time with practice, then you're looking at 73 years of gameplay to actually get the blinks right. And if you got your success rate up from a third to somewhere else, it's conceivable that 7 hours was too early to give up, and I could expect myself reasonably to get, a higher average at some point. But the thing is, the first couple hours spent doing something like that are the time when you're going to see, the most success. That's the steepest part of the learning curve, is right when you've started. You're going to get way better right at the beginning because you're learning the most basic part of what you're doing, and learning the most basic part is, the easiest part. And as you actually really hone in and narrow down on what exactly you need to do every single time, that's when progress starts to slow down. But after 7 hours, I could only get it about a third of the time. So I think if I spent 50 hours, maybe I could get it half of the time or something like that, and half of the time would still be way too unlikely to be worth it. So I don't know if I've really proven my point here as far as blink is concerned, but I believe that it is a completely unreasonable thing to ask any player to do. I don't think that anybody will ever do blink without a macro, because the actual technical requirement there is absurd. And if someone wants to disagree, I would really love to see how they think that it's reasonable for me to spend 73 years of pure gameplay learning how to get this done. And I know that that's kind of working towards the high end and talking about how it would work if I only did it every 1/3 of the time. But either way, you're still looking at a gigantic time loss here. So now that I've talked about why Shadestep is just not really an option in my mind, and why, because if Shadestep is not an option, nothing is an option outside of blink, and blink requires a macro, I think I have pretty much arrived at the conclusion that a macro is necessary. This is all the groundwork that I did summed up to why I decided to use a macro. I was like, okay, in brevity, I was like, okay, no ability works outside of Shadestep and Blink no ability works outside of Shadestep and Keen Scout consistently with human error being a factor. And then Shadestep is not good enough, even without human error, to work. And then Blink then becomes the only option, but it's completely unreasonable to expect anyone to do it, because literally if I tried to do it from now until I died, spending every single instant of my life doing it, there's a good chance I would die before it happened. I think considering all of that, a macro is the only real option, which is why I decided to use a macro, because I think it was the only option. And that is the only reason I would ever use a macro, is because it is the only option. And I'm not going to just ignore a challenge that's going to be interesting for you guys to watch and interesting for me to play, because it requires cheating on a very small level. I mean, I could have set up the macro to do more than it did, and I did not do that. I set up the macro to do the most basic necessity in order to actually get this running. I could have had it pick up a part, blink, sword for me, and take that burden off of me, blink again, and then sword. And yes, that is possible. You can get 2 blinks per part pickup and 4 sword swings per part pickup. You can completely delay the encumbered buff to a huge extent. And I didn't do that because I was trying to use the macro at the lowest possible level to get this run done. So at this point, I would like to point out, I guess, 3 other things, probably. So 1, if someone does this without a tool, as in a macro, and if someone even strategizes and comes up with convincing proof that they've come up with a workable strategy that does not require blink more than 6 times, I would be willing to test it out and see if it looks reasonable under any circumstances. And if it turns out that they're right and it's possible, I will gladly publicly apologize for cheating in this community, and I will gladly take my video down and do everything I can to try and get the rightful competitor all the attention that they deserve. I would be glad to do that. I think that would be a perfectly fair thing to do, and I would feel like a huge jackass for resorting to cheating when it wasn't necessary. That said, I really don't think it's likely that that will happen, but in the case that it does, I will bow out of this whole competition as a complete loser and scumbag who cheated without good reason. I mean, I think I had good reason, but I have been wrong before. I have been wrong about things that being impossible before, so it's definitely within conception that could happen. Another thing that people have been bringing up is how it was disloyal of me to my fans to not reveal up front that I was using a macro, which I understand that complaint. I think that it is perfectly legitimate, and I can understand why that would upset some people. But the fact of the matter is, I am a streamer and a YouTuber, and I cannot afford to give up competitive advantages in cases like this, and none of my competitors would ever disclose the same sort of information if that was the conclusion that they had reached. If other people came to the point where they were using a macro, they wouldn't tell me they were using a macro because there's a huge competitive advantage associated with that, and because it's a reasonable conclusion to draw based on all of the prior premises, it's not like it's technically unfair for them to make the decision that a macro is the only way, because at some point it becomes the only way, and therefore if it is the only way, and anybody strategizing could reach that conclusion, there is some fairness associated with actually using it, in my opinion. You can disagree with that if you'd like, but I think that at some point using a macro becomes a reasonable next step, and I am under no obligation to share that I have made that next step when it is going to give people who have not put the same groundwork and I have the same advantages that I have. If I spend 30 hours looking at this and decide, okay, I need blink, and blink requires a macro, and then other people put in 10 hours and think that blink is still not the only option, I don't think that I have to disclose to them that I am using a macro to make blink work, because it is the only option, because they haven't reached the conclusion yet, and that's on them to reach the conclusion. That said, I understand that other people put in just as much time as I did. I think they were much more interested in being purists about the challenge, which I understand, but I am not interested in being a purist in something that I consider impossible. I would rather see a challenge done with a macro than never done without a macro. I don't think that that's reasonable. At any rate, the point that I have been trying to get at here is people considered it disloyal for me to not tell everyone else up front that I was using a macro. But you wouldn't hold a non-streamer to that obligation. If I was only doing YouTube, you wouldn't exactly expect me to go into every other people's channel and tell them, like, hey guys, this is impossible, I've started using a macro. I think the fact that I owned up to it after the YouTube video is really the most that you can reasonably expect from me. I don't think that it's actually reasonable whatsoever to say you should have told us up front, because, again, that gives my competition the exact same strategic benefit, and I'm under no obligation to reveal every single thing that I do just because I am streaming it. I realize there is a level of deception there. I realize that people are going to disagree with that, and I guess that's okay. At the end of the day, I am not interested in disclosing every single thing that I know on stream when it's going to be necessary for me to increase exposure to my channel, because this is my primary source of income. If you want me to, like, completely shoot myself in the foot and not increase as much exposure as I can and not be a successful channel, then I will eventually have to quit YouTube and do other things. So, I mean, it really it's pick your poison here. Either sometimes I'm going to have to hold off on revealing the full truth until I've made progress, or I will eventually probably not be able to do this as an actual job. I don't know that I have enough going for me in terms of anything other than technical skill and strategic skill to really justify having a channel without successes like the one that I posted with the solo siege engine that is tool assisted. Again, I totally understand people are going to disagree with that. I understand the perspective of people that think that you shouldn't use a macro if it's impossible without a macro. There are going to be people who would think, like, you know, if it's not possible without one, just don't use one at all. And I can understand the point there, but the fact of the matter is that this challenge was cool with a macro, it was difficult with a macro, and it was still fun to me. And if you don't like the way I play games, then, I mean, there are tons of other channels, I guess. I mean, I can't reasonably be expected to cater to every single person. That's just not, that's not a thing. I'm pretty sure that talks about, like, literally everything about this entire challenge that I need to talk about. I mean, to sum everything I've set up in the video in just like a couple sentences, I don't think this is possible without Blink. I think Blink realistically requires you to use a macro. I would be glad to bow out of this entire situation and take my video down and apologize to the community as a whole, and specifically to whoever beats it if they find a way to do it without tool assistance. And I'm not going to apologize for using tool assistance until that point, because it just would make no strategic sense to reveal that that was where my strategic groundwork had led me to go. I mean, if I'm the first one reaching the conclusion, I don't really see why I should have to disclose to everyone else that I am the first one to reach the conclusion, if it is indeed the only conclusion. The thing is, like, if someone finds a non-tool assisted strategy, then they would prove that I was wrong in my conclusion and that I had jumped wrongly to using a macro when I shouldn't have, and in that case, that would be understandable that I would be basically a fraud and a cheat and a completely unfair streamer, player, competitor, etc. But until someone proves it is possible without one, there's really not any fair criticism to level against me. Okay, so I just remembered one final thing that I really do need to say. I am sure I'm going to come off as pretty conceited here. I think there's going to be people that think I sound really arrogant, like I'm the only person who could have possibly reached this strategy or whatever. But I would like to point out that I think that's really the farthest thing from true. I think what it really is at most, the most arrogant thing I would say about myself is I might be a little more realistic than other people, because I think I reached the conclusion that it was impossible before other people, and other people were clinging to hope that it was possible without this, so they kind of focused on pursuing the wrong end goal. I think that they tried putting too much effort into something that wasn't going to happen because they wanted to abide by the principle of not cheating and reach the end goal regardless. And I came to the conclusion that principle is just not relevant. It's not going to get me where I need to go here. There's no way for me to beat this without cheating. So I cheated. And I mean, you can look at it like cheating is really a really negative word here. I think that's really extreme, considering when you talk about something like speedruns, tool-assisted speedruns are a separate category for a reason. Like, me completing this challenge is not directly hurting anyone, unless, again, there is someone who eventually proves it can be done without tool assistance, in which case it would be hurting them. But because I don't believe that will happen, and I don't believe there's anyone to be hurt by it because of that, it's pretty hard for me to feel guilty about it. I mean, I don't really know what else to say about that topic. Like, until someone proves it can be done without tool assistance, and proves that I'm wrong to think tool assistance is necessary, there's really no one for me to apologize to for using tool assistance, because it's not even something that's competitive to begin with, and I don't even think that I'm better than the people who weren't using tool assistance to begin with. I'm not claiming, certainly not claiming the moral high ground, certainly not claiming the brain power high ground or anything like that. I mean, I reached a different conclusion than other people, and my different conclusion was vastly easier than what they were trying to do. And that is the reason that I got it done first. Now, I would not really endorse the other the use of macros for really anything in Destiny, period. The only time that I've ever had any reason to use it was this particular challenge. I think that will probably be true for a long time. The amount of frame-perfect movements in Destiny seems like it's pretty unlikely to increase. Yeah, I guess that's it. I guess I've said everything I want to say. If you think I'm conceited and arrogant and full of myself, feel free to, I don't know, I feel free to think that, I guess. I don't feel like I'm full of myself. I don't feel like I'm better than someone else. I don't feel like I'm smarter than someone else, and I certainly don't feel like I beat the other players in a completely fair competition here, that I'm not at least under some level of being wrong for having not told my stream up front that I was using a macro. Because, I mean, there's definitely complexity to this, and there's definitely, I guess, there's shades of gray here. Okay, yeah. One very, very last thing. I would like to remind people that I didn't have to own up to using a macro. I could have just lied and said that I was a god that actually got the timing down for the blinks. I could have just completely, I don't know, fabricated the whole thing. I didn't do that. I was pretty upfront about the fact that I used a macro as soon as I did. I posted all about it on Reddit, and I've talked about the reasons for it and such all over the place. If someone thinks that it's not acceptable of me to not tell it up front and to only save it for after a challenge has been done, that's understandable. I think that is a fair criticism, but I think given the circumstances of the fact that other people are competitors, and this is the type of challenge I brand my channel on, and my competitors would not offer me the same benefit if they came to the same conclusion that a macro was necessary. They wouldn't tell me either. I don't think that you can expect me to tell the public at large when telling the public at large will make it get to my competitors who are very willing to keep a competitive advantage over me. I recognize there's a lot else to be said in terms of whether or not macros are strategic tools that are okay to use in Destiny, but because I think they're pretty much useless everywhere else, I'm really not that worried about it. I don't think we're going to see macros used for really maybe anything other than Titan scaling, and if we see them in Titan scaling, then, you know, we'll just we'll call people out for it. We'll tell them that it's not okay to cheat, because as a community, I think it's pretty easy to come to the agreement that cheating is not okay, and if you're going to cheat, you really should be kind of condemned by the whole community. And I mean, I could see where I could suffer that same fate on some level, but again, if it's the only option and it's done purely for the sake of getting a challenge done that would not be done otherwise, like, again, Gladiator did a voice command Crota kill, which he had to use a macro for because the voice commands had an input delay and there was simply no way to kill Crota without it. If it's just for a challenge that's not going to hurt any other player and it's the only way to get it done, I really don't think that it's possible to criticize it. And some people, again, to reiterate this point for the billionth time, if you think it's possible to criticize it and you think it's unfair to use a macro, I disagree, and I think the only situation in which that's true is if it was possible to have done without a macro. So until someone proves that it can be done without a macro, I really don't think I have anything to apologize for here, And I actually think that anybody who has been, shit-talking me for using one, I feel like they should definitely reevaluate their position on this, and hopefully, considering I've talked about it for an hour, I've given you something to think about as to why I came to this conclusion. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed this really long discussion of it. And if you've made it this far, I really appreciate your time and your viewership. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time.